as an editor, you get asked to do a lot of meet the editor type sessions, but they're generally about, tell me about your journal, tell me about publishing, whereas, and will challenge me to kind of reflect a little bit on my journey as an editor and a little bit on some of the lessons I learned along the way. And I guess kind of give people an insight into what it looks like on the other side of the desk and my motivations for doing it, what I gain from it, and perhaps just put it on the radar of people in terms of its contribution to academia and our community. So my title is inspired by Adele, Hello from the Other Side. I won't sing it, I won't subject anyone to that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey, how I fell into editing and how that journey unfolded over that period of time. I'll talk a little bit about my personal motivations, why I did it. A little bit on some of the kind of lessons learned and some of the principles that I kind of used to inform my role as an editor at the various journals I've been involved with. A little bit of reflection on engaging with editors, but that's not really the core of the presentation, because that's the kind of stuff that's covered a lot more at general meet the editor type sessions. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for a good discussion at the end. So as Andrea said, please pop questions into the Q&A as we're going along, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion at the end. So here's kind of a timeline of my journey, well, at least a potted history. It's not quite everything. My editorial experience started really early in my career. So in 2003, I was a PhD student at the University of Limerick, and my supervisor and good friend, Mike Morley, hosted an international HR conference. And out of that conference, Mike had a number of journal special issues and also 2 books that came from that conference. And as a young doctoral student, I was lucky enough to be invited to be part of a number of those outputs. So there was 2 books. I just put up one of them there, International HR and International Assignments, which Mike, Noreen Herity and I edited. There was a second book on New Directions in Expatriate Research. And then there was 2 special issues. There was the International Journal of Manpower and a Personnel Review special issue. Actually, I just realized that Anne Will had a paper in the special issue in the International Journal of Manpower, randomly enough as it happens. So I got this really early exposure to editing, far earlier than most people would do. I guess before I had been a reviewer for anything substantive, I was kind of thrown into the deep end as a reviewer, and Mike just kind of was very generous in terms of bringing the wider conference organizing team into some of the projects that were involved. The books were 100% aligned with my research, which was around kind of mobility and that space. So they were an easy call. The special issues were a bit broader, but kind of broadened my scope into kind of wider international HR type issues. But it kind of piqued my interest very early in my career to be involved in those. And kind of, I think from my point of view, it was just an opportunity that kind of came available. I had the capacity to do it, and I had a very generous supervisor who trusted me to be part of the team. So that kind of whet my appetite very early. A couple of years later, and again, this is just kind of a potted history. First, Hugh Scullion, who I got to know through my supervisory team. He was a good friend with Paddy Gunnigal, who was my other supervisor, had been working on this global staffing book for a long time, and it was very slow coming together. So he asked me would I come and work with him on that book. And that book was actually probably the thing that really solidified my interest in mobility as a topic, and really kind of I read so broadly across the area of global staffing as part of that book. It's an edited book in that a couple of the chapters are contributed, but actually we wrote a significant majority of it ourselves. And I guess what these 2 things point to is the breadth of activities that come under the banner of editing. I think we often just think of the editor-in-chief role in a journal, but actually it's a very wide remit. So far I've been a guest editor at a special issue and a book editor, very different roles. I guess the book editor role is very much about coming up with the structure, the logic, the theme for a book, identifying and persuading contributors to come on board, cajoling them sometimes. And the editing is often much more light touch. It's particularly particularly if you have a really strong author team who kind of deliver as promised. But relative to journal editing, the editing is more light touch. The special issues are a great introduction to being an editor, because all the systems and processes are in place for the special issues from the conference. We invited people who had submitted to the conference to put forward their papers for submission, and we managed the review process. So then in 2006, I also with you, and I guess on the back of our work on the book, we guest edited a special issue of Human Resource Management Journal on international HR, which again was a lot of fun. It was a journal that was core to the areas I worked in and one I knew very well and had read. And again, that turned out very well. In the meantime, I did a couple of more edited books. And then in 2008, I think my kind of career as an editor really took off when I was asked to be part of the editorial team at Human Resource Management Journal. And I guess the key thing to say here was there was a lot of luck involved here, in that I certainly wasn't the first choice as editor. Mick Marchington was the editor at the time. Sadly, Mick passed away in the last couple of months, so and sadly missed by those of us that knew and worked with Mick. But Mick was the editor, and again, Human Resource Management Journal was kind of, I guess for many of us, the core HR journal on this side of the pond for HR research. So initially edited by Keith Sisson, then John Story, then John Purcell, then Mick Marchington. So some of those really fathers of HR research in Europe over the years have played really important parts in it. And others like John Purcell or Peter Boxall and Yap Powie were associate editors. So a really strong tradition. So Mick was the editor, and at that time the journal was kind of starting to build up in terms of the number of submissions. Mick was kind of coming towards the back end of his term and wanted to move on, and approached a couple of people who kind of didn't take on the role. So then Tony Dundon and I were approached to be involved. So Tony Dundon, who's now at the University of Limerick, and I were both at Galway at the time. We came on board. And actually, it was the perfect journal to become involved in, because it had a lot of the really fundamentals in place. It had a decent reputation. It had good papers. It got good submissions, but it hadn't got an online submission system. We were still managing through email. It wasn't on the ISI, and again, Anwell knows that story as well as anyone. But part of the reason for that was the ISI really struggled to differentiate between HRM, the US journal, Human Resource Management Review, and Human Resource Management Journal. So there was no real sense of what the actual impact of the journal was. There had been a couple of cases put together to apply for inclusion on the ISI, but never been successful. So we had, so many of the fundamentals in place, and yet a lot of low-hanging fruit that could move the journal forward. So one of the first things we did was we moved the journal onto Manuscript Central as a submission system, which really makes the review process much more efficient. If you go back, those of us that remember, even prior to email, when you submitted your papers in a letter, and then, the editor had to send out letters with reviews and wait for reviews back. HRJ was a step ahead of that, in that it was email, not snail mail. But what an editorial management system does is it really just makes the process much more efficient. The reminders are there to chase reviewers, papers don't go missing, reviews don't go missing. So we did that, and that certainly helped the process. And we, on our second application, we were accepted into the ISI, which I think was huge in terms of the recognition of the journal in certain countries. There's a number of countries where, when they look at rankings or where journals are valued, ISI impact factor is one of the core things they look for. So we really took on a great journal and I guess moved it forward in ways. I learned a huge amount from working with Mick. Mick was an editor who cared deeply about the papers, and he was no shrinking violet. He was very direct in his feedback, but also very developmental. And the time and effort he invested in his decision letters to authors taught me a lot about what the standard was and what the bar was for responding to authors. So I was involved in HMJ for about 6 years. Between that and the next kind of step here, I also took on an editorial role at the Irish Journal of Management, which is a real niche Irish journal. It's owned by the Irish Academy of Management. It had kind of fallen off the rails a little bit and kind of hadn't been published for a couple of years. Relatively small number of submissions. I was asked to take it on. And again, it was something that I felt was important to the Irish Academy. So I did it. It didn't involve that much work, and I'm glad to say that continues on. In 2010, again with Hugh Scullion and Paula Caligiuri, who's now at Northeastern, we guest edited a special issue of the Journal of World Business. And on the back of that, I was invited to be on the board of Journal of World Business, where the editor I dealt with mainly was Wayne Cassio, who's now a good friend and a great mentor. And Wayne was another person I learned a huge amount from in terms of what a good editor was. Anyone that's ever had a paper managed by Wayne, the time and effort he puts into his decision letters it's just phenomenal. And when Wayne stepped down as senior editor, he recommended me to replace him at Journal of World Business. So in 2014, I became a senior editor. There were associate editors at Journal of World Business for HR and talent management. Jonathan Doe was the editor-in-chief. Within about 18 months, Jonathan asked me to take on a deputy editor role, so I took on a bit more responsibility. And about 12 months after that, I became joint editor-in-chief with Jonathan. And again, Journal of World Business, a very different profile, more international in its orientation, more wider than just HR, obviously, in terms of an outlet. And again, a tremendous learning experience, very different exposure. A journal that was equally in a very good place. Fred Luton's and John Slocum had edited it for 20 years. They had taken it over. It had previously been at Columbia University as the Columbia Journal of World Business, left it in a good place. But again, some pretty low-hanging fruit that just needed to do to move it forward. In our time, and again, I take no credit from it, JWB moved from a 3 to a 4 on the ABS list, reflective of its standing. And I think it really solidified its position as the #2 journal in IB after JIBS. Likewise, HMJ in our time moved from a 3 to a 4 on the ABS ranking. And I think a lot of that was down to stuff like getting it onto the ISI and just kind of continually chipping away and improving the quality of papers we submitted. So I did Journal of World Business for about 4 or 5 years in total. Decided that I didn't really want to continue to be editor-in-chief. It's a big journal. It's 1,000 papers a year nearly at this stage. It's a big commitment. So I moved on from that, I think in about 2018. In 2019, I just have kind of another example of the different types of editor role. Many of you might be familiar with the Global HRM book series. It was set up by Michael Poole, Randall Schuler, Susan Jackson, and Paul Sparrow. It's published over 30 books at this stage. So all of those Michael Poole sadly passed away a number of years ago, but Paul, Randall, and Susan were stepping down, and Randall approached me to know would I be interested in taking on that book series as the series editor. So that was my first role then as a book series editor, another box ticked on the editorial journey. And I'm delighted to currently do that with Elaine Farndale at Penn State and Fang Lee Cook at Monash in Australia. And then hot off the presses, it hasn't been announced yet, but I've just agreed to take on an associate editor role at Academy Management Perspectives. And that term will run officially from 2022 to 24, but we start handling papers later this year. So that's kind of a snapshot of my editorial journey. There's a few other bits and pieces there, but that was kind of broadly it. Personal motivations, why did I get involved in editing? I think there was a lot of kind of happenstance and luck. Opportunities came up and I took them. I think from the special issue point of view, I think that was probably more deliberate. I think special issues are a great way to put a stake in the ground in terms of an area. So I've edited a number of special issues, for example, more recently in talent management, which is an area that is in the relatively early stages of evolution as an area of research. And being involved in those special issues, I think kind of was partly about positioning myself in that area in terms of creating opportunities for dialogue in the community, but also in terms of my role in terms of leading some of the discussions. And really a lot of the special issues we did were really about trying to create some space for discussion when it was difficult to get some of those papers published. My most cited paper by a long way is our Human Resource Management Review paper in 2009 on talent management, and we couldn't get that paper published. It ended up in Human Resource Management Review, but we tried a few places before that. And I think when an area is early in its days, it's much harder to get stuff published. So that was one of the reasons why I got involved in the special issues, was to try and provide colleagues who were interested in the area with some space to develop their research in the area. My editor-in-chief roles, as I say, were never planned. So HRMJ came up because, a couple of people didn't want it, and Mick ended up with Tony and I, and Tony had a good relationship with Mick as a former student, and we kind of agreed we'd take it on. Journal World Business came about, through a recommendation from Wayne. So a huge amount of luck, but took the opportunity and played out very well. I think the collaborators were key. So HRMJ worked because Mick was there as a mentor for Tony. Mick Marchington was there as a mentor for Tony and I, and his role was hugely impactful in terms of my learnings when I was there. When Mick stepped back, we brought Adrian Wilkinson on board as a co-editor, and again, Adrian was someone with a lot of experience, based in Australia at the time and currently, so also kind of expanding our geographic reach as a journal. So again, learned a huge amount from Adrian. Tony and I were good friends and colleagues. So the people I worked with were key to it. Likewise at Journal World Business, Jonathan Doe, a great colleague and friend who I learned a lot from. So I think those relationships were core to my personal motivations to do it. I may not have done it if the same people were not involved. I think from a personal point of view, there's certainly an element of wanting to give back to the community. I think, we're all very quick to judge and to complain when journals don't operate as effectively as they can. So I kind of felt a bit of agency in terms of, well, can I help the community in terms of trying to ensure these things operate effectively and maybe move them forward a little bit. And I certainly recognize the potential to learn from those processes and being involved, and I most definitely did. I learned a huge amount about the field because I get to read so much outside my core areas, so that's a big thing. I learned a lot about how to engage in review processes and how to engage with editors, which has stood to me in certain contexts. And I've learned a lot from the colleagues I've worked with. So I think, in the whole, I think there's no doubt that I learned a huge amount. Kind of building out that, what did I gain? So yeah, for sure, I learned a lot. I think that's no doubt. I think being an editor at a journal brings profile and status within the field. That certainly wasn't my motivation for doing it, but I think certainly it's a way to get your name known. I would say being a book editor actually relatively probably is an even bigger return on investment in terms of profile. I would say a lot of people know me through some of my books more so than my journal editing. So again, if we look at the staffing, that global staffing book was, did relatively well at the time and was used in a lot of courses. My talent management work, in 2017, we published an Oxford Handbook of Talent Management, which I think was kind of one of the things that kind of solidified my profile in that area of talent management with Wayne Cassio and Kamal Malahi. So I think certainly being involved in roles like this bring profile. As I say, it definitely wasn't why I did it, but I think it certainly helped. I think when I look at how my career evolved, I think those editorial roles were very useful to me in terms of developing a narrative around my leadership for promotion applications and job applications. So when I took on Human Resource Management Journal, I was still a lecturer in NUI Galway. I have no doubt that in making the case for my senior lecturer application, the leadership that the story I could tell around leadership from the journal was not insignificant. Certainly when I went for a chair, applying for a chair in HR, having edited one of the core journals in our field, no doubt helped me in terms of telling that story. And, you know, I always, if I'm talking to people about particularly kind of associate professor or chair roles, I always kind of say that it's really about articulating your leadership, and your role as a leader is what differentiates really good applications and really good interviews from one another. So people from a research point of view tend to focus too much on their output. So I've published in X, Y, and Z, whereas actually the really strong applications, the really strong interviews can talk about the impact of that research. And for me, the fact that some of that research at least gave me the credibility to take on these journals, and I was able to lead in the wider academic community, I think was certainly something that enabled me to apply for a chair maybe before I would have on the back of my research alone, and certainly gave me a huge amount of credibility when I did. And I think there's no doubt that being involved in these journals has massively expanded my network and some of the opportunities. So, you know, arguably I wouldn't be here today, you know, talking to you if I hadn't done it. So, you know, there's a very real example. But, you know, I think the importance of my colleagues in terms of those editorial journeys. So when I did my Fulbright a couple of years ago, I was on Fulbright at Cornell, and two of the visits I did during my trip were directly linked to those relationships I had with editors. So Jonathan Doe at Villanova, who was my co-editor at JWB at the time, invited me to come to Villanova to do a seminar. Got to meet with so many great academics there. And Wayne Cassio invited me to UC Denver. So I again, likewise, got to travel to Denver and meet and spend time with so many of Wayne's colleagues there. So I think my network has been greatly expanded through being involved in the journal. So I think on the whole, there are certainly time commitments and opportunity costs of being a journal editor, but from my perspective, the benefits far outweigh any of those costs. I try to kind of not make this overly academic, so I really have focused on my own experience. But I think one of the challenges when you take over as an editor and you try to learn about being an editor is there's actually very little to learn from. So one of the things I did at the time was, you know, try to see, you know, what books are out there or what kind of articles are out there about being an editor. And there's very little. I did find at the book at the time, one book that was edited by, I pulled it off my shelf, Yehuda Baruch, Alison Conrad, Herman Aquinas, and Bill Starbuck, on opening the black box of editorship, which I bought at the time and read. But, you know, one of the very few books, and I was kind of scanning through that and preparing for this, and I like this chapter by Alison Conrad around being an editor, and I think some of the principles she talked about being an editor kind of resonated with me. So just not trying to be overly intellectual about the process, but I thought it was just some nice points about editorships that framed it. So the first point she made is gatekeeping is necessary. And I guess the point she was trying to make here is that, you know, part of a role of an editor is to gatekeep the development of knowledge in a community. And what does that mean? Well, without an editor and without a review process, journals could simply publish everything that was submitted to them. But if you look at a journal like Journal World Business, we were getting 1,000 submissions a year and probably publishing, you know, fewer than 100. If we publish everything, then we're very quickly going to get to a stage of information overload. People won't have any kind of heuristics in terms of where to look. to know which work is likely to be better or more relevant than others. I think as an editor, you have a key role to kind of safeguard quality thresholds. So, I think a key role of the review process is to try and ensure that the work that's published in the journal you are leading meets some minimum criteria in terms of how the work was conducted and how it was put together and the communication that's in it. So I think there's certainly that. And I think, work that's published in journals, particularly high-ranking journals, is a signpost to the community that this is some of the more impactful work out there, that, we're moving towards kind of work that's more likely to kind of shift your thinking a little bit or move forward debates in a significant way. I guess the biggest challenge that an editor faces, and this is kind of linked to the next one, is that, you're trying to balance that gatekeeping role with not suppressing innovation, right? And I think the challenge is that, at certainly the higher ranked journals, almost every reviewer rejects every paper. So that means your judgment as an editor becomes critical. And we've all seen the different types of editors. There are what I call traffic light editors, who simply count the number of yeses and nos or revisions versus rejections and make a decision on that basis. And to me, that's not good enough, because, as an editor, we have to weigh up a whole series of decisions in terms of trying to make our whole series of factors in terms of trying to make decisions around papers. So we're weighing up the reviewer's input, but we're weighing that up in the context of knowing who those reviewers are, the perspective they bring to bear, why we've asked them to review the papers. So are we asking them just for their expertise on the methodology? Are we asking them as an editorial board member that knows the journal and the thresholds in the journal? Are we asking them as an ad hoc reviewer in a more kind of specialist sense of the content of the paper? And as an editor, we're weighing up the journal pipeline and the relative quality in the journal pipeline, the types of papers in the journal pipeline. Do we have space for the paper? Often we make very difficult decisions on the basis of some factors that are not immediately obvious to the wider external audience. I guess at HRMJ, a decision we often had to make was, in more crowded fields where there was a lot of research, like, for example, we would have got a lot of papers that were like HR and performance type papers, right? So, an area that's been researched to death in many ways. So in those crowded fields, as an editor, I'm weighing up the relative contribution of a paper compared to the wide body of knowledge that already exists, versus an area that's newer, where the potential for contribution is greater because we know far less about it. And as an editor, you're also responsible to the readership of the journal. So, oftentimes when and this hopefully becomes more apparent at the desk as opposed to when a paper comes back from a review process. But one of the things you're weighing up as an editor is, well, is this the right home for a paper? And I rejected many papers as an editor where the paper was actually really good, but it was just the wrong home for it. And one of the tests I often did, and I always did this after reading the paper as opposed to before reading the paper, was look at the literature it was citing. And if a paper never cited an article that was previously published in a journal, then that's probably an indicator that the conversation you're trying to join as an author is not unfolding in the journal that you submitted the paper to. I think as an editor, you need to recognize that this is a high stakes game and there's a potential for moral hazard. So, without getting into the theory of it, right, plagiarism is a big issue in our journals. We have the issue of the integrity of the blind peer review process. So ensuring that reviewers don't know who the authors are, or if they do, they're transparent about that, and vice versa. We have, the potential for moral hazard in terms of, as an editor publishing in your own journal. When I was editor-in-chief at a journal, I never, ever published in a journal I was editor-in-chief of at the time I was editor-in-chief. And we see a lot of people who do that. And to me, that's a really slippery slope, and something that I would certainly personally wouldn't do, even in special issues. So I at both HRMJ and Journal of Our Business, during my time, we developed guidelines around special issues that were very explicit in terms of what special editors could do in terms of publishing in their own special issues. Plagiarism obviously is more and more of an issue, and we've tons of examples of plagiarism in some of the journals I was involved in. I think it's important to be aware that subjectivity is innate in the process. So as an editor, obviously I suffer from bounded rationality. I don't know all the areas I'm making decisions on papers on intimately. I'm very much reliant on my review teams to inform me about areas. I have my own biases in terms of areas, and I need to see beyond them and be aware of them and try and challenge them. We often question as editors escalating commitment as a paper has been through a number of rounds in the review process, and trying to continue to be fair to authors in terms of trying to make decisions as early as possible, but yet recognizing sometimes papers go down the road and do need to be rejected in very difficult decisions. And I think the absolute importance of communication as an editor, so the importance of being clear to authors why you've made the decision you did, what they as authors need to do to be successful in revising a paper, what are the factors that will mean this paper will be rejected down the line. Some personal principles for effective editors. I think the first thing is, when you're an editor, you need to be all in. So you need to be 100% committed to it. Journals and publications are so central to individuals' careers. I think you really need to be committed to doing the job well and being efficient, because it's a high stakes game for people, as we said in the last one. So I think, the day you stop being committed is the day it's time to move on. And that's why I would have a view about terms for editors. I think, we can all probably think of examples where journals have started to go a little bit downhill when editors have been in situ for too long, because I think often one loses the enthusiasm, one loses the hunger for trying to do it well. So, I'm a big advocate of terms for journal editors. Most start with 3 years. I think 3 years can be a little bit short to do all of what one might want to do. But I think if you're talking about a second term of 3 years, then you're definitely coming, towards the end of what I think is a useful period to be a journal editor. I think it's really important to understand the identity of the journal. And I think, rather than one way to reduce the subjectivity in the decision-making process is to bring the decisions back to the editorial statement of the journal. What is this journal about? At HRMJ, that was about the management of people at work, right? That was fundamentally what it was about. So we got lots of really micro papers that really weren't about the management of people, that were more like micro organizational psychology papers. And some of those got rejected because they just weren't close enough to the journal. What's the balance between theory and empirics and contribution? So really understanding the identity of the journal, and really that's the lens through which one views the papers. Kind of related to the first point, being an editor is kind of service to authors and service to the community. So it should always be authors first. And your role as an editor is to be fair, and it's to be developmental. So even if you end up rejecting a paper, try and give the authors something to take away that they can move it on. So most top journals desk reject 30 to 40% of papers. 20% of those, are like half of those decisions are really easy decisions. The paper clearly isn't a fit with the journal, or clearly would never meet the criteria for the journal. And many editors just kind of send a very generic, this is a poor fit for our journal. But I think even 1 or 2 points that help the author understand why it was a poor fit, or suggest to the author where it might be a better fit, or if there's a particular flaw in the paper, point that out, the high level stuff. Doesn't need to be tons of detail, but that goes a long way. I remember when I was involved in HRMJ, I don't actually remember the initial paper, but I rejected a paper from somebody. And a number of years later, that person reached out to me and said, the first paper I ever submitted was to HRMJ and it got rejected. But I'll never forget the encouragement you gave me in the decision letter. And I always said that when, I think he said something like, when I make it, I wanted to write back to you and say thanks. And he said, I've just got promoted to a senior lecturer or whatever, and I just want to say how much that decision letter meant to me. And every so often you get a letter like that, and it really just reinforces the importance of the role one does as an editor. I think it's really important to build a great team. So when we took over at HMJ, there were no associate editors. We were one of the things we did was build an associate editor team. And I will say over the years, not just at HMJ, we didn't get all those decisions right in terms of who we appointed to the associate editor teams, but they're critical decisions, because one of the challenges when you expand the number of people making decisions about papers at a journal is it's harder to maintain the principles, the consistency, all of the kind of things that are core to what the look and feel of a journal and its reputation. So you need to make really sure that the people you bring with you on that journey are coming from a similar place to you. To me, I think, good reviewers. I think, there are many senior academics that are terrible reviewers. So the first thing I look for is somebody that's a good reviewer, that has a developmental tone in their reviews, that's timely in their reviews, that's a good communicator. I think these are the things that are really, really important. And after that, then, a lot of the other stuff is secondary, where they are in their career. I'm much less concerned about that. I'm concerned about their values, their ability to read papers and see the wood for the trees, and their ability to give feedback in a constructive way. I think in an editor-in-chief role, there's a lot more work to be done in terms of managing external stakeholders, whether it be the publisher, depending on who owns the journal, whether it's a society owned or owned by the publishers. Your role as an ambassador for the journal in terms of meet the editors. So I would say the difference between being an associate editor and an editor is the editor's role is much broader in terms of all that external stakeholder management. For me, the single key measure I look at my term as editors is, did I leave the journal in a better place than I found it? And I think, I would certainly hope that all of the journals I've been involved with, the answer to that has been yes. But I think that's always been my objective. And linking back to the very first point, you need to know when it's time to move on. You need to recognize when you're not, it's a big commitment to be a journal editor. You need to recognize when it's time to move on. If one is asked to be a journal editor, what are the key kind of considerations I would say to take into account? Career stage. So obviously it's a big commitment, and it takes your focus off other stuff. Time is a zero-sum game. So, if you're being an editor at a journal, it takes your time from researching, it takes your time from teaching. So I think it's really important that it's aligned at your career stage and makes sense for you. As I said, I got involved in HMJ relatively early. I was lucky. I had no commitments, I had no kids. I was able to kind of just work longer hours to get it done. If I was at the same career stage and had kids, I probably might have come to a different decision in terms of my capacity to do it. So it needs to fit with your career stage. If you're thinking about, promotion, then, unfortunately, in most of our institutions, publications come first. And I've sat on appointments boards where people have ticked lots of boxes that were great for SL, but didn't have the building blocks in place, for example, in terms of publications or a story around teaching before they jump forward to do some of those things. So I think career stage is hugely important. I think building a baseline of expertise through reviewing is the starting point. So, most of our journals now share the reviews of other reviewers, the decision letters, a great way to learn about the development process that papers go through. Being on editorial boards, also really important. So obviously a higher workload than being just an ad hoc reviewer, but hugely developmental. Thinking about different editorial roles. So the route for most people is either, they edit a special issue or two, they are an associate editor before they become an editor-in-chief. For me, it was special issue to editor-in-chief. I was an editor-in-chief before I was an associate editor. I would say special issues, like I said, are a great way to stake a claim to an area. I think the key is if you're looking to be a special issue editor, again, put a good team around you, that you have some kind of other, if you're more junior, some senior people on the team that kind of create that credibility. Associate editor roles much more bounded than editorial editor-in-chief roles. There's normally kind of a set expectation around the number of papers you need to manage, and it's largely that kind of manuscript flow management as opposed to the external stakeholder management. Editor-in-chief is obviously a much bigger gig. I think thinking about the focus and or the discipline of the journal relative to your career priorities. So, obviously HRMJ was a core HR journal. It was relatively easy for me. Journal of World Business, a lot of my work is in the international space. I went as a senior editor for international HR. It was a good fit. The Academy of Management Perspectives, it's a much more general management journal. So again, it's a different perspective for me. But being deliberate about decisions in terms of that fit with your interests and your expertise and your ambition. I think whether the journal is owned by a society or a publisher makes a big difference in terms of your experience as an editor, and this is particularly as an editor-in-chief. Personally, I would be a lot more inclined to work with a society-owned journal rather than a publisher-owned journal based on prior experience. I think a society is generally driven by purer motives, if that makes sense. And that's not, there's some great journals owned by publishers too, but I think there's a lot more commonality of purpose in society-owned journals for the most part. I think you need to be very thoughtful about the workload implications of being involved. I would say being editor-in-chief at a big journal could cost you a day to a day and a half to 2 days a week at certain points of the year. Being associate editor is going to cost you a minimum of a half a day to a day a week, depending on the size of the journal and the size of the ask. So in that regard, I think very careful thought put into workload decisions, whether it's possible to negotiate some workload release in your department. I think it's something that should come into the process. And again, I don't want to dwell on this because this is done to death in Meet the Editor sessions, but I think it's always important to remember that editors want to publish papers. And I think many of us, particularly early in our careers, kind of see the editor as this kind of person that's just there to kill our paper. That's not the case. Editors want to publish good papers. They want to publish innovative research. And I watched something over the summer that was talking about doctoral committees and doctoral supervisors. And basically the argument was, when you get to the stage when you see your doctoral committee as helping you to challenge your ideas and helping you to develop those ideas and helping you to push forward those ideas, that's when you're really going to start to make progress as a doctoral student. And I think most editors are really trying to help you develop the ideas in your paper. So, if you get an R&R, try and engage in that constructive dialogue with the editor. Try and listen to their feedback. They're seeing the paper as a reader will see it, because often, one of the biggest problems with papers is when we write them, we make assumptions about what other people understand. We make assumptions about what other people, how other people will interpret it. If 3 reviewers and an editor are interpreting your paper differently, then there's a problem with how you've written it. So listen to them. I think, just to reinforce this point is made all the time, editors make decisions, not reviewers. So I've had plenty of papers where reviewers were more positive towards a paper or more negative, where the decision has been the opposite to what the reviews might suggest on their own. Why? Because sometimes those reviewers tell me something in their comments to me that's not in their decision letter or their recommendations. And all of those other factors that we spoke about earlier in terms of the relative state of the field, how mature it is, the pipeline in the journal, the readership that you're trying to get to with your paper, all of those things. A good editor isn't a traffic light editor that just says, well, 2 versus 1, so your paper is rejected. A good editor should give you direction. I think it's really important to listen to that direction and be guided by it. They're trying to help you navigate the review process in a positive way. And editors make many, many tough decisions. There are so many close calls in terms of whether a paper is accepted or whether a paper gets a revise and resubmit or rejected. And they don't get them all right. The vast majority of them are making them for the right reasons. The vast majority of them are doing their best to make good decisions, but they certainly don't get them all right. So just because your paper doesn't make it through a review process doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a good paper or that it won't be successful elsewhere. So takeaways, being an editor for me has been an honor, but it's also come with huge responsibility. it's been challenging, but it's been hugely rewarding. It certainly has benefited my career, no doubt whatsoever. Each opportunity is different. So, there's not a boilerplate here. I think every journal is different. Every experience being an editor is different. But for me, the positives far outweigh the negatives and costs in terms of being involved. So I was a couple of minutes longer than I said to be. So I'm going to stop there in the context of time, and hopefully we have some good questions that we can pick the discussion up with. Thanks so much.